And welcome to a very special edition of Idaho Reports, the pundit panel, right after our discussions with the candidates for the 1st Congressional District. Joining me here at the pundit table is Bill Manny from the Idaho Statesman and Jim Weatherby, our pundit here on Idaho Reports. Thank you both for coming in. Bill, my first question to you is, where are we in this 1st Congressional District race?
Well, I honestly don't expect any surprises. I think people who were maybe anticipating that the Donald Trump factor would change the dynamics, I don't see it. I see a 1st district that is still very conservative, a tough challenge for a Democrat, a tough challenge for a first-time candidate. I don't see anything different than the last time around when Labrador won handily. It doesn't mean we can't be surprised, but I don't see it.
This is, of course, the same district that Walt Minnick was elected to a number of years ago as well. Jim, do you agree, though, with his assessment?
I would agree with that. Walt Minnick did win in 2008, defeated Congressman Bill Sally, who came out of a 6-way GOP primary with 28% of the vote. He was not a strong candidate for re-election, so Democrats can surprise from time to time. Walt Minnick was a well-known name, and as opposed to James Piotrowski, who is not that well known and underfunded, and will have a difficulty, I think, getting traction in this race, even though, as we've found in the debates, particularly the KTVB debate, very aggressive in terms of his attack on Representative Raul Labrador's record.
Piotrowski, he's smart, he's articulate, he's well studied, he's a good first-time candidate. What he doesn't have is what Walt Minnick had when he won, which is the Barack Obama tailwind. You know, Obama won when the Democrats took control of the White House. You certainly don't see that kind of dynamic happening anywhere, especially in Idaho this time around.
And that was a different era. Walt Minnick wins along with a lot of other blue dog Democrats. Where are they today? They're almost all gone. There is virtually no center in the House of Representatives. They're polarized left and right.
What is Piotrowski's end game? Why is he in this race? Certainly, he hasn't followed the traditional method, which is perhaps run for city council, run for the legislature. What is it that he wants to accomplish out of this?
Well, for the good of our politics, without endorsing Piotrowski or anything else or any other Democrat running, I would hope that there would be Democrats who run, they don't have any political experience, but might run again. Often we have Democrats who run for congressional offices, who run and lose, and then we never hear from them again. I would hope we'd hear from Piotrowski again. I think he's a very interesting candidate. He still has work to be done. It's hard for him to answer. He doesn't want to answer some specific questions about debt reduction, for example, or what he might do in Congress. And it's not quite clear what kind of Democrat he is, but he certainly has been aggressive in pointing out some of the issues with the Labrador record.
Aaron, I asked Piotrowski the question when he was at the Statesman. He hasn't been on the city council, he hasn't been on a county board of commissioners, he hasn't been in the Idaho legislature. He's a first-time candidate. But one thing he said was that he's happy with the Democrats who were representing him in those offices. There wasn't somebody he wanted to run against. The other thing I think that animates Piotrowski is his passion for outdoors and public lands, and what he said and what he has said, and I take him at his word, is that was the issue that galvanized him in this time of discussion about access to public lands and the possible, or at least the discussion of the possible transfer of public land. So I think the combination of issues that he was passionate about and a candidate that he wanted to see challenged, and no one else was coming forward, I think he decided that he would throw his hat in the ring.
And at the same time, go ahead.
Now, he was pleased with the Democrats in his district when he was in the North End, as opposed to where he is now living in Eagle.
You know, you'll have to ask him about his residential priorities. I did not have a chance to ask him about that.
When asked about what committees that he would like to serve on, it seemed very interesting that he kind of chose agriculture as opposed to something that would be a little like natural resources, which would be more on the public land side.
Right. Well, what he told us was that his personal passion is public lands and natural resources and the outdoors, but that he thought he could do the most good if he served the 1st District from the Agriculture Committee. And he talked about, the rolling wheat hills of North Idaho and the products from Western Idaho that are a big deal to the economy. So I think it's interesting. I'm not sure that it would be as interesting for him as doing battle over public lands, but that's what he said is his first priority for effectiveness for the district.
Go ahead.
I heard him in our KTVB debate ask about committee assignments, and he said, well, there are enough Democrats on the Natural Resource Committee so that he might go over to the Agriculture Committee. Well, you could see if for some reason he is elected to Congress, Congress certainly could change. In terms of the House Ag Committee, I don't believe there is anyone serving from Idaho at this point. He said there were a lot of Democrats on the House Resources Committee, but a number of these Democrats are from states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and California.
He talked about, he's actually been very outspoken about Raul being an obstructionist in Congress. How would he turn that around and be a consensus maker, particularly in this day in time?
Well, that's a challenge. I believe when you were interviewing me, he talked about you have to go to the center and come up with a compromise. The problem is there isn't a center in the House of Representatives anymore, so that will be difficult.
Well, in this Congress, for Democrats to get anything done, they have to work with the other side, right? So it would be inevitable that if you're a Democrat in a Republican-controlled Congress, you'd have to work with the other side and try to make deals. I think you can look at the personalities someone brings to the office. Labrador has been a staunch believer in smaller government, fewer taxes, less federal government intrusion, and he's not going to, he has not let the possibility of deals and compromises dissuade him from what he says is his priority. I think if your interest is in finding ways to get smaller bills passed, then you have to compromise and you have to make deals in order to get that done. So I think it's a matter of the approach you bring to the office, and Labrador has found success with his approach. The 1st District has elected him 3 times, and he's not changing his pitch to the voters this time.
Speaking of Labrador, when I asked him about being an obstructionist, it was very interesting that he said people want a loud voice or they want to go over to Washington to blow it up, but what he describes himself as a fighter. Is that an accurate way of describing someone like Labrador in Washington today?
Labrador in Boise, a fighter, a very vigilant fighter against Governor Otter's transportation package, and he was successful in defeating that effort. A fighter in Washington, D.C., he's a fiscal conservative. As he indicated, since he's been in Congress, the deficit has gone down. I'm not sure he's taking credit for all of that, but he felt more comfortable that the deficit was going down from $1.4 trillion to $450 billion. And now the deficit is starting to rise again, and his strategy now is to vote against every appropriation bill, which is a somewhat risky strategy for any member of Congress.
Absolutely.
Where they're expected to bring home the bacon. And in this case, voting against an increase for veteran services, voting against funding for secure rural schools for the timber-dependent counties. He's open for a lot of criticism here, though he's laying down a marker that something has to be done in terms of addressing this ever-growing $20 trillion debt and growing every day.
I think this is an area that both Labrador and Piotrowski kind of sound very similar. They both said not necessarily let's throw more money at it, but how do we make some of these programs run more efficiently?
Well, Piotrowski's problem is he doesn't have any examples, he doesn't have a plan, and maybe that's too much to ask of a first-time campaigner. But when asked, he was asked about how he would approach dealing with the debt, and he said that, well, he'd get rid of bad programs. Now, how can you argue with that? Though, then when asked what a bad program was, the best he could come up was with a $1 million beer cozy program.
Well, in his defense, he did talk about not financing Pentagon spending that even the generals wouldn't want to finance. So he talked about some military spending at the time. I wanted to go back to the fighter notion because I don't think you can argue with Labrador's description of himself. I mean, this is a guy who took on the sitting speaker, and at John Boehner, and is candid about his not being ready to support Paul Ryan for next time. This is a guy who's taken on his own party, and he hasn't backed away from those fights. So I think, whether you want to call it an obstructionist or you want to call it a fighter, I think, he is as described. It was really interesting when we talked to him about, well, what if he wants to run for governor? He does make a distinction between legislating and governing. And he said, look, I'm a legislator. I've been a legislator. In Congress, I'm a legislator. I fight for the best bill I can fight. If I'm a governor, then I have to govern. And then it's my job to bring the parties together to make things happen. So he does make a difference between the job of a legislator and the job of a governor, not capital G, but small g, the executive. And I think he's been thinking about that, and I think when you listen to him talk about it, it's clear he's thinking about the different roles he would have to play if he does run for governor.
Jim, that was a question that you asked him in the KTVB debate, specifically was his ambitions to run for governor here in the state of Idaho. Were you surprised at all by his response, which is, I'm not thinking that far in advance, and I'll make that call when I make that call?
I was surprised. There are all kinds of rumors that he is going to run, and he is a leading candidate for governor. And he's been thinking about that since at least 2012, if not earlier. But I asked him, would you, after this election, I didn't use the example, but I could have, of following Butch Otterslead, who in his last term in Congress was elected, and then I think the very next day announced for governor. Labrador, he said, I will do the work we need to do. I still want to work on criminal justice reform. I still want to work on immigration reform. And those issues that I will finish before I leave Washington, D.C. That's a high bar for a prospective candidate for another office to say that within your term you're going to solve two major issues that have been plaguing Congress for a number of years.
So is it your read, Jim, that he's going to stay in Congress and not run for governor this time around?
I'm surprised if that's what happened, but looking at his statement would lead you to believe that's indeed.
So I would come down just the other side. Listening to him talk about legislating versus governing persuaded me, and I have no other reason than just listening to him talk, that he is thinking about it, and I would not be surprised if he announces here sometime in the next few months. And I think a lot of people have been critical of him running for Congress while he's thinking about running for governor, but that's the way politicians work, and nobody really expects you to start talking about the race you're going to run after this one. I mean, so he's handling it pretty much the way other congressmen looking at other jobs would have handled it.
But I'm just interested in this flat statement. Indeed, he may run for governor, though that's a significant risk. There are already two candidates in the field, and goodness knows how many others are going to get into this race. There are a lot of Republicans that have been waiting for 12 years now, and now there's an open seat. And it could be quite a crowded primary field before this is all said and done.
Jim, do voters deserve to know the answer to whether or not he's thinking about running for governor?
Oh, I don't think so. I think voters deserve full-time attention as best that candidate can provide for his term of office. But I understand the realities of politics and know that politicians move from one office to another.
Right.
But in this case, at least Mr. Labrador has put down a couple of markers in terms of what he will work on, and he wants to finish before he moves on to another position.
Let's talk about the evolution of Labrador over the last few terms. Has he changed a whole lot, and do you think we'll continue to see a change in over the next 2 years?
Boy, my take is he's essentially the same guy who ran as a legislator that brooked the establishment here in the State House and did the same when he went to Congress. I think he is better at articulating his philosophy, his kind of discourse with you about the role of the various branches of Congress, and the House that's supposed to be responsive to the passions of the nation, and the deliberative Senate. I mean, he's better at articulating why his brand of legislating is effective and should be returned to Congress. So I would say it's the same guy, but he's better at explaining why he does what he does.
And he is not a bit bashful about talking about gridlock and the benefits of gridlock. I don't know whether the Founding Fathers had that in mind. I know they had in mind a tension and conflict among the branches of government. Whether they would go as far as wanting gridlock, which would prevent us from dealing with a number of major problems. But at least he's out there speculating about this. You usually hear this from think tanks, libertarian think tanks, but here is actually a member of Congress talking about the benefits of gridlock, and in his case, wanting to do that to call attention to what he considers the most serious economic threat to the country, and that is the debt.
Is that fairly unique to see somebody not changed from their time in D.C.?
No, I've seen a number who have changed, whether it be a member of Congress or whether it be a city council candidate or whatever, once in office, hit with the realities of governance. Mm-hmm. And this is interesting with Labrador in that people are questioning whether or not he can make this conversion. Indeed, if he were to become governor, right. It's interesting that he's talking. I haven't heard him talk much about this. I've heard him discuss governing in a different context, in a New Yorker article where he said, governing then brings together more spending and more government.
And he was very dismissive.
Very dismissive.
He used air quotes.
And of course it was perhaps a quote that was not fully explained, led some editorial columnists to say, well, wait a minute, isn't that your job to govern? And you say you're not going to govern?
The one thing as I sit here and think about what happens in Washington, and how might that change Labrador's thinking? If you were to have a President Trump and a Republican Senate and a Republican House, would he then see a better chance to do the kind of things that Jim just enumerated? I think if it's a President Clinton and possibly a Democratic Senate, then I think there's a whole lot less incentive for a Republican from Idaho to want to go back and keep beating his head against that wall.
Yeah. Speaking of the election, the Idaho Statesman has a voter guide.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So most of the candidates who are running in this election have answered a series of questions for our online voter guide. You can go in there. You can tailor our online voter guide at idahostatesman.com. You can put in where you live. It'll tell you what district it is, who the candidates are, and you can compare their answers on the issues. It's really valuable. It will get really busy in the days leading up to the election. So if you want to do your research, do it early, and then, as Phil McGrain would probably urge you, also vote early. Avoid the long lines at the polling place on Tuesday.
Now, what about the Luddites?
You?
Yes. Well, you have a published voter guide.
We'll have a print voter guide on Sunday, October 30th, I believe. Though it does not. It's limited by space, whereas the online voter guide has much more information about all the candidates. So for Luddites like Jim, or people who just like to feel
I'm just concerned about all of the viewers here in terms of what is accessible and what isn't.
Yes. So Sunday, October 30th, and then that should give you a taste of what you can find online as well.
And of course, don't forget to vote on November 8th. All right, Bill Manny from the Idaho Statesman and Jim Weatherby, thank you so much. That's going to do it for us. We'll see you back here next week.